BookTube, it's Angie. Today I wanted to talk about some of the books I did for Memorial Day reading, the week of pretty much. There is one book I did read actually on Memorial Day. I'm hoping you guys had a great Memorial Day and were able to give your thanks and your respects to a past veteran in your life. So I just had just a few. I know some of my videos run long because I try to do like a big stack in one video, just because, I don't know, I get caught up in themes sometimes. This video, I only have 3 short little ones to talk about. And some of you might be like, doesn't matter, you're gonna talk forever. But I don't know, some of you might like it because you're here and you visit. The first one, what was the first one I did? I think the first one I covered was Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried. This is the second Tim O'Brien book I've read. I think the first one was called Northern Lights. I read it years and years ago, and if I remember right, I think it had to do with 2 brothers. I can't remember if one of the brothers was in Vietnam. I know one of the brothers, it focused on these 2 brothers. I know one of them was in the war. I can't remember if the other one was or not. I feel like that story had to do with like one of the brothers being really hardcore affected by his experiences and the other one struggling with his brother being so changed by the war. I think it had something to do with that. I may have told the story about how I came about having that book in one of my other videos. I don't know if I mentioned it was that book, but it happened because years ago I was dating this guy who liked to have these book parties where it was basically a dinner party, and at your place setting he would give you a book, and he did this every so often, and I thought it was a really cool idea. The very first one I went to right after we started dating, he had asked me prior, what's your favorite genre? And I said, well, one of my favorite genres is historical fiction. And when I opened my book at the table, I saw it was Tim O'Brien's book, and it was about Vietnam. And partly it was my fault because I guess I didn't specify what part of historical fiction I gravitate towards. But I guess I should have mentioned to him that Vietnam is one of the areas in history that I'm not afraid to pick up books in that time frame, but I do, it's down on the bottom of the list as far as what I gravitate towards, simply because my own father was in Vietnam and had a lot of, not only because of Vietnam, but because of other things that happened to his life, but the problems he had were definitely exacerbated by his experiences in Vietnam, and he came back with severe PTSD. So it's hard for me to read those books simply because they hit a little too close to home when they talk about what goes on when the people come back, because I lived with it pretty much my entire childhood. So I space them out. I'm not afraid to read them, but I space them out. And I read this Tim O'Brien book, and it was just, it wasn't that it was painful, it was just, it was really sad, but a lot of it was also just really slow and boring, and just a lot of these conversations where nothing was really happening, nothing pivotal was really being said, nothing was really speaking to me at all throughout the majority of the book. I still read it though, because I do have a rule about when a friend gifts me a book, I do at least make the attempt to read it, even if it sounds like something that's not for me. If a friend has given me the book, I will at least make a honest attempt to try it. So that story being said, I picked up this book simply because I picked it up not too long ago, but I picked it up simply because the story sounded interesting on the back, and then when I got it home I kept seeing that name and I was like, that sounds familiar, and then I realized it's the same guy, and I was like, oh no, because I was really scared. I still have really bad memories of that first book I read, and I was really scared that this was going to be a drudge fest as well. It actually wasn't that bad. I didn't love it. If you go on Goodreads, this thing has rave reviews across the board. There are some in there where people that it was kind of a miss for people, but most people absolutely loved this book. It was just like a solid 3 for me in the end. Tim O'Brien is one of those writers where I feel like his writing, there's something about his writing I appreciate. I think there's something really strong to his writing, but his plots just, they start out good and then they fall off somewhere for me. I don't know, I'm split with his books. It's like he writes these things that sound really cool and I'm really excited to get into them, and then I don't know, it peters out partway through. But I'm still trying with him though. It's gonna be a while, I think, before I pick up another one of his because I need that buffer. But anyway, getting on with the actual book here. This particular one, The Things They Carried, has to do with this one particular US troop that's serving in Vietnam during the Vietnam War. A lot of the book is told through just these little scenes, basically. It's not always entirely fluid. It's kind of like told through little snapshots almost. It starts out talking about the things they carried. It talks about what these guys had on them and what that said about them, like letters and supplies, the guys that were chosen to carry certain supplies, what some of the men chose as their good luck charms and what that meant, and just their personal effects and what that said about them. That's the early part of the book, and then the more you get into it, the more you start to learn about the individual guys themselves. Some of the men that made it home, some of the men that didn't, what happened to the men that didn't, and how that affected the men that did get home. The thing I struggled with this book is I can't remember, I don't think it happened in Northern Lights. I can't, and that's the only other book I've read of his, so I don't know if it's something he commonly does, but in this particular book, this is sort of written in a autobiographical fiction style. It's technically a novel, but the confusing bit is Tim O'Brien gives the narrator his name, Tim O'Brien, and Tim O'Brien is writing a novel based, well not based, but inspired by a lot of the experiences he had while he was in the military himself. Tim O'Brien, the author. But you're being told the story, the novel, through Tim O'Brien, the narrator. And it's not a style of writing I'm a huge fan of, simply because it messes with your brain as far as keeping straight where the author stops and where the story begins. Another example I ran into of this was when I read Everything is Illuminated by Jonathan Safran Foer. He did that in his book. He gave the narrator, or one of the main characters, his name, even though it's a novel and it's not necessarily based on the author's life. It's just confusing because your brain wants to keep relating it to the author themselves because their name is in there. That kind of tripped me up here and there. The other thing was, I wasn't really sold on the way the soldiers were portrayed in this book. When I went into this, I was hoping it was going to give me something that, I mean, it's about Vietnam. I knew it was going to get gritty, or at least I expected it would, and I knew there were probably going to be some graphic passages and wasn't going to be sugar-coated because the majority of the Vietnam vets I grew up around, they didn't sugarcoat stuff. If you asked them a question, they would either choose not to tell you or they would choose to tell you straight up the answer to your question. They didn't do a lot of buffering. And growing up in a military family, that's the way I experienced a lot of veterans, is they have one or the other. They either don't tell you anything, or if they do tell you, they're pretty honest. They don't they don't make it all nice and pretty for you, and you know, they may curse, then they may give you gritty details, and they may be graphic about it, and if you complain about it, they're like, well, you asked. But I'm trying to figure out how to word this. The way the men were portrayed in here, it felt like it was just a troop of weird, creepy guys that fixated on really bizarre stuff, and it didn't register with me, with like my own experiences of growing up around Vietnam vets. There's one guy in here, I think his name is Lieutenant Jimmy Cross. It talks about how he's kind of obsessing over this girl back home, and when he left, they were sort of in this question mark area of their relationship. I don't know that they were officially committed to each other, but they were kind of maybe going in that direction, or they had gone on a few dates and he was hoping it was going to go in that direction. And she continues to write to him, and he's out in Vietnam, he's constantly thinking of her, and he's obsessing over everything about this girl, and he obsesses over whether she's a virgin or not, and does he want her to be a virgin? Maybe it would be fun if she wasn't, but then could he respect her if she wasn't? Can he marry her if she wasn't? And he goes back and forth and has these like inner monologues about what he thinks about her status as a virgin or not. He's thinking back to, I think it was the last date they had gone on before he left, and he's kicking himself because he didn't do something more bold to show his feelings for her or his hope that they would continue with the relationship. And I'm reading it going, oh, okay, that's kind of sweet. And then he says something like, I should have done something more bold, like taken her back to her room, tied her up, and touched her knee. And I was like, all right, Jimmy, that's a little creepy. A little creepy. Bold, maybe. I don't know, the flash mob? Flash mob might have been bold, or parachuting down in the middle of a park to ask her out, that would have been bold. Tying her up and touching her knee, that's just assault. I mean, it is bold, but not in a good way. And then he's talking about this pebble she sent him, and she tells him this really sweet story about how she was walking on the beach and she saw this pebble sitting on the coastline, and she was like, oh, well, I thought it was kind of representative of you and I and how it was touching land and sea, and so it was kind of like we're separate but together. And I was like, oh, that's nice. And then he starts talking about how he sits around sucking on this pebble, and I was like, again, you take something good and make it weird. Stop making it weird. So Jimmy kind of lost me. There's also talk about how one of the guys, because he kept getting distracted about thoughts back home, maybe caused the death of one of the other guys in the troop, and the guy ends up dying in the middle of a sewage field. And another guy is, when I was talking about good luck charms, there's another guy that, and you know, not carrying a rabbit foot or a lucky penny. No, he decides to cut the thumb off of a Viet Cong teen and make that his lucky charm. And there's a lot of bizarre creepiness going on with this troop. It may be a little bit odd, but I think one of my favorite scenes in the book, or one of the favorite passages, even though it got a little weird, it at least kept my interest the most, I'll say. There was a guy in the troop who had his girlfriend come over from the States and visit him where they had a base in Vietnam. When she comes over, she's very sweet and innocent looking. She's dressed very nice and conservatively, and she's very excited about everything going on. She decides to stay a couple weeks and get to know all the guys, and at first her boyfriend is very excited to have her there because she gets really into learning the culture and the local villagers, and she even picks up some nursing skills, or at least helping in the nursing tent. And he was like, oh, this is great. She's helping and she's curious. This is amazing. This is the incredible, strong woman. And then his girlfriend somehow ends up spending more and more time with this special forces unit that's on base. And she starts going off on missions with them. And then she starts like pulling within herself and getting really dark and wandering off in the middle of the night. Nobody knows where she goes, but she always comes back with this special forces unit, and she starts turning into this whole other person whenever her boyfriend tries to talk to her and tries to figure out what's going on, because, you know, he has this intention that this is going to be his wife when they get back home, and then he sees what she's turning into, and he tries to talk to her and say, well, you know, what do you do in the middle of the night? What are you seeing? And she, more and more the conversation starts to turn into, you wouldn't understand, and you couldn't handle what I've seen, and she goes dark. The massive character shift in her I found really interesting. Even though it did get really dark, I found it made for really interesting reading compared to all the weird creepy crap that was going on with all the other guys. A lot of the book, I felt like the story had potential, but a lot of the book was just very slow, and where O'Brien decides to put the focus I found was really bizarre, and I don't know, it sometimes just missed the mark for me. Just to give you an idea of what I meant with the writing being strong and compelling, but like the topic going off course or just kind of very left field for me. I marked off one passage to share with you guys. This is a passage about Jimmy when they're doing some patrol, I think. It said, after 5 minutes, Lieutenant Jimmy Cross moved to the tunnel, leaned down, and examined the darkness. Trouble, he thought. A cave-in, maybe. And then suddenly, without willing it, he was starting to think about Martha. The stresses and fractures, the quick collapse, the two of them buried alive under all that weight. Dense, crushing love. Kneeling, watching the hole, he tried to concentrate on Lee Strunk and the war and all the dangers, but his love was too much for him. He felt paralyzed. He wanted to sleep inside her lungs and breathe her blood and be smothered. He wanted her to be a virgin and not a virgin all at once. He wanted to know her. Intimate secrets. Why poetry? Why so sad? Why all that grayness in her eyes? Why so alone? Not lonely, just alone. Riding her bike across campus or sitting off by herself in the cafeteria. Even dancing, she danced alone, and it was all aloneness that filled him with love. He remembered telling her that one evening, how she nodded and looked away, and how later when he kissed her, she received the kiss without returning it. Her eyes opened, not afraid, not a virgin's eyes, just flat and uninvolved. So, he writes characterizations pretty well. It's just, I don't know, his topics get weird. Just weird. The other thing I would mention is this book does have some graphic scenes to it. There's the guy dying in the sewage field. I would also remark for people that are sensitive to animals being harmed in this book, there is one passage that talks about a live dog being detonated. One part that bothered me, because I don't like reading about animals being harmed in books, there was one part that talks about these soldiers using this baby water buffalo as target practice for sport, pretty much just because they were bored. And reading that pissed me off. I'm sure stuff like that probably goes down with soldiers. I'm not saying like all of them, but I'm sure there are jackass guys like that do that sort of thing, but it still pisses me off to read. I would just note that for people that are sensitive to that, to know that those passages are in there going in. The second book I read was Vanished by Wil S. Hylton. This is a non-fiction book. It's an investigation into a crew of 11 men that disappeared during World War II. They were flying a B-24 Liberator. I'll try to put up a picture here so you can see what one looks like. They were flying a B-24 Liberator and I think they said they were over the island nation of Palau, which is around, I think they share water borders with Indonesia, and I think it's Indonesia and the Philippines, that area. The Air Force had record that this plane had gone down, had crashed over this island nation, and there were eyewitness reports that said people on the ground said that they saw parachutes coming down after this plane had gone down, and they claimed they saw guys land on the ground, but after the crash there is no record of what happened to these guys. Nobody came forth and said, oh yeah, they went to town, or they, you know, found another boat and went anywhere. These men never showed up anywhere. And so the Air Force, for, I think in the book they said like this investigation's been going on since the crash. So it was like 60 plus years. They've been looking into this, trying to figure out what happened to these guys. This book looks at one particular guy. I think his investigation started, I think maybe in the late, I forget now, but I think it started maybe in the late 80s or early 90s. And it was this guy, Dr. Pat Scannon. He was actually a medical researcher. He worked for a biotech firm, but he just had an interest in military history. And Dr. Scannon had a friend who was actually researching, doing some exploration work, trying to track down this ship that was said to have been sunken by President Bush Sr., the first President Bush, during his Air Force career. It was said that this ship that he shot down was considered his virgin kill, or the first target he ever took down. And Pat Scannon went on this trip with his friend just because he was interested in the history, and he was thinking, oh, how cool would it be to be part of that research. And it just so happened on this trip, while he was trying to scout out areas to try to find the ship, he came across this area that had either not ever been investigated or not been investigated as much. And it was in this area of Palau that he found not one, but 3 different Liberator crash sites. He just became fascinated with the story. Like, why are there 3 here? I thought there was only 1. So he took it upon himself to try to find the answer to why there were 3 ships over here, or 3 planes, I mean. Why there were 3 planes, and what the story was behind that. So he went back home and he started investigating all this stuff on his own. He contacted the Air Force and wanted to look into the flight records and the crash reports and all of that from that time period. And he found out that the crash reports were horribly underwritten. It was just tragic how just sad those reports were. It's like a lot of the people writing the reports, like, they didn't even try. It said some of the reports he came across were literally only a few words long. It was just like, yeah, they went down. And that's all he had to go off of. And he was kind of upset because he's like, well, you know, there are families attached to these guys. You know, of course they're upset. The military is saying they're looking for these guys, but there's like no follow-up on any of these reports. It's just hanging out in there. And he said, how are you supposed to find answers? So he was like, well, I'm going to start trying to figure this out. And he didn't have a lot to go off of with the crash reports, so he started trying to track down veterans that were maybe still alive that had served with the guys that were missing. And he did find some veterans that knew the guys and had served during their time. And so he was able to piece together some of the story with that. Not all of it, though. So that's basically what this book covers. Is this focuses on what Dr. Scannon was able to figure out with this mystery. It's not the mystery of the crash. They know they crashed. They're not quite sure how they crashed. They don't know. They're guessing the planes were shot down, but hard to say. But the majority of it tries to focus on what happened to those guys, who were they, how did they end up on that plane. The one plane he's focusing on, or at least the one he started with the investigation, there is a little bit of shadiness going on. There's a bit of a juicy story behind one of the planes. He was able to find out about why those guys ended up on one of the planes. With this one, I liked the history they get into for the most part. There's good history. I went into this hoping he would go more into the backstory of the guys that had gone missing, because they do know the names of the guys and they do know their families. One of the things that makes this kind of fun to follow is they do have like maps in here that you can look at to get a better idea of where these guys were working. And then each chapter also has relevant photos, either from the dive team as they were working in more modern times. Because this investigation that Dr. Scannon did, this went on for years. I think they said close to a decade, maybe even a little bit more than a decade he was researching this. I was looking for this. So they have pictures in here of some of the different crews he's talking about and some of the different people, their families he was talking to, some of their veterans. He gets into their backstories a little bit, but he doesn't get into it quite as much as I was hoping. So he focuses a lot on the history around, like the general history surrounding the time period when this plane went down, which I know it's important history because it's good to place what was going on at the time to get an idea of, you know, the situation these guys were working in. But I felt like some of the time he focused a little too hard, he by Hylton, the guy that wrote the book. Felt like he focused on some of the, what I felt like were extraneous details that were interesting for a minute, but then like he got caught up in it. And it's just, I think it just happens sometimes when you read a nonfiction book, when you read something that someone spent a lot of time researching and like maybe they found fascinating and they learned all these facts. They want to use all these facts they learned and they want to give it to you. I can get that because on my channel here I talk a lot about things I've read in books that have to do with history and science, and part of the reason some of my videos run long is because I get caught up in history because it's history that interests me, and I was like, oh guys, you should hear this. And I know that not everybody's gonna find that interesting. And maybe that's what happened here, is he got caught up in the history that he learned and it just didn't translate quite right when I was reading it, and I was like, oh yeah, that's neat. And then I kept wanting him to move on or go back to the personal stories of the men that were missing, rather than focus on the general history of the time period. So I struggled with that a little bit, and it just, I went up and down with this because there were some passages where Hylton was sort of imagining what was going on with these guys when they're in the planes, essentially being attacked, and he's trying to recreate those last moments. And when he's doing those scenes, those are really descriptive and really engaging, and you're like, yeah. And I got caught up in that writing, but then the more technical stuff, he doesn't have that same sort of voice. It just gets very dry, and I'm having to like sludge through that to get to the interesting part again. And it just, for me, that book went up and down a lot, where it was really riveting and then, okay. There is a lot of really cool history if you like World War II history, if you like military history. There's a lot of interesting bits here, but there are other bits that you may be skimming over. I don't know. Some of the stuff I liked was, I liked reading about George Bush's seniors, the little bit they focus on with his aviation career, because I had heard about it, but I hadn't really known that much about it. And this talks a little bit about his early days as a pilot, which I thought was kind of cool. I also really liked the passage that talked about how when they first came out with the Liberator plane, the type of plane that went down in this book, when the military first came out with those, they actually had aviator Charles Lindbergh come out and take a look at it. Do a test flight on it, and they're like, yeah, try it out, see what you think, let us know. And Charles Lindbergh comes back and he's like, yeah, and he basically tells them in his own way, this thing's a piece of crap. He's like, the gears stick, it's very clunky and heavy, and it doesn't respond that quickly. And he actually tells them, I sure as hell wouldn't want to be in this if I had a target firing at me. I mean, he tells them point blank, he's like, this is crap. The Army continued to make them anyway, even though you have somebody like Charles Lindbergh saying, this is crap. These are going to get people killed. Not only did they continue to keep making them, I think in this book they said the B-24 Liberators were actually made more than any other plane. Even after this whole test flight with Lindbergh, the military just kept churning them out. If you look, you know how I normally post my written review links below. If you look down below in my written review, I posted the actual direct quote from this book of Charles Lindbergh's words, or his response after doing a flight. But then there's another part I thought I would share. I think I also included this part in my written review as well, but in case you don't look at those, there was one part in here I was going to share that talks about Black Sunday, which happened after this whole test flight with Charles Lindbergh. On the morning of August 1st, I think this is 1943 we're talking about, a formation of 177 liberators departed from Libya, sweeping over the Mediterranean and up the western coast of Greece, past Albania and Yugoslavia, to reach the Ploesti refineries. But as the 1,700 flyers, or pilots, approached their target, they ran into a heavier defense than anyone expected. As a hail of anti-aircraft fire lit up the sky, the B-24s shattered and dove through smoke and flak, airmen leaping to their deaths in the burning refineries below. With 660 flyers lost, it was the deadliest mission in Air Force history, known as Black Sunday. Yet the impact on the Nazi machine was negligible. According to an intelligence committee at the newly built Pentagon, the Ploesti raid accomplished no curtailment of overall product output. So, according to military documents, they basically said, we made all these liberators, a lot of people got shot down the way Lindbergh predicted, a lot of guys got killed, and it made no damn difference, pretty much, on keeping the Nazis at bay. So they're basically saying a lot of these guys died for nothing. Oops. That kind of turned my stomach to read that. There's a lot of interesting history if you don't mind it being a little bit dry in bits. I will say that the closing chapters of this book I felt like ended on a really strong note, and the closing chapters were pretty touching as far as when some of the families were contacted with what they discovered during this investigation. There was one in particular that I thought was pretty special, where they mentioned one of the guys that was contacted was the now grown son of one of the men that went missing, and Scannon contacted this guy and said, we may have located your father's plane. And as soon as this guy's son, this missing pilot's son, got the news, he said it was the dead of winter in Texas, and he immediately went out and signed up for scuba certification classes and trained in the dead of winter in Texas so that he could be certified by the warmer seasons, because he said he wanted to go and see this plane in the water for himself, even though he was terrified he was going to come up on his father's remains, possibly. So I don't know, that story got to me. But yeah, I think the closing chapters ended on a high note. So it was a solid 3 for as far as like historical interest and what they were able to find out for this. The one I actually read on Memorial Day, and I think the one I had the most interest in overall out of these 3, was this little book, Over to You, by Roald Dahl. Same guy that wrote Matilda and Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and the BFG and all that. This is some of Roald Dahl's lesser known work. He, I think, is pretty commonly known as a beloved children's author, but what people talk less about is the fact that he was also a fighter pilot for the Royal Air Force during World War II. He went on various missions, and he got pretty seriously injured in a mission over Libya, but he recovered and went on to fly more missions over Greece and Syria, and then moved on to an intelligence position. So he had all these wartime experiences, and this little collection is stuff that he wrote. There's 10 short stories in here, and these are loosely inspired by some of the things he saw during his wartime years. There's a little intro in here from Roald Dahl that clarifies that nothing in here is based off of any one person he knew specifically. It's just generally inspired by some of the things he saw, which is kind of relieving after you read the collection, because some of these stories get really weird and So it's good to keep reminding yourself it's not based off of anybody he specifically knew. All of the stories in this involve pilots in some way or another. There's only one story in here. I think it's called Only This. There's one story in here that's told from a female perspective. The female being the... They don't specify whether she's a wife or not, so I'd say she is at least just like the lover of a pilot. And that story is told from the perspective of her waiting at home, waiting for him to come back from war. And it gets surprisingly creepy. You know, it starts out just her standing at a window and hearing all these sights and sounds, and her being a little bit alarmed along with the other neighbors in her neighborhood. And then it just, from there, it has an eerie twist at the end that I was not expecting. Other ones in the collection are really poignant and a little bit heartbreaking. There's one in here called Katina that I thought was one of the most powerful ones in the whole collection, about these two pilots who, I think they're in Greece in 1941, and they are doing like ground patrol, walking in this area that got bombed recently, and they come across this girl who don't know exactly where she's hit. She's just scraped up and covered in blood, and she's just standing on this pile of rubble. They're worried for her because she's a very young girl, and so they decide to, she doesn't speak any English, and they decide to take her back to the base camp and have the base camp doctor look at her and see if they can clean her up a little bit. And over the course of the story, this little girl, she starts to learn words here and there so she can communicate with these pilots who found her, and she gets attached to them. But then, you know, there's still a war going on, and it turns out that this girl was very much mentally affected by the things she experienced in her village. She reveals that she was the only one in her family that survived, and she didn't get over that. The actions she takes after that because of what she saw it's really heartbreaking. And the ending of that story, it was very cinematic, but it was just because you're just picturing this little girl and the horrors she must have gone through, and just, yeah, that one was maybe the hardest one for me to get through. There's other ones in here that they were very like reminiscent of an old kind of like Twilight Zone or Hitchcock type episode. It had that little bit of that, not really terrifying, but enough to like give you goosebumps kind of weird. There's stories in here that the way the people are talking to other people, it has you wondering, are they talking to real people? Are they imagining these environments? Are we seeing them in their heads? Are they actually in some like psych ward somewhere? Some of the stories get out there. Some of the stories have a little bit almost paranormal twist to them. I think that's one thing that doesn't get acknowledged a lot with Roald Dahl. Is I think when you're reading his children's stories, you can definitely see the imagination and the sort of magical, whimsical quality, but you don't see quite as much with his children's books, like just how dark and out there he can get. And then you get into his adult fiction and you're like, is this the same guy? Same guy. And there was one story in here, I think it was called Piece of Cake, and it focuses on this one pilot that when he starts the story, he's kind of overly confident in his skills, and he thinks like nothing bad is gonna happen, and he's like, oh, whatever, you know, got this piece of cake. And then he goes on a mission and his plane catches fire, and he goes into this sort of emotional shock, and he can't get himself out of it, even though he can see the fire in the plane and he can see that it's inching towards him and he's gonna catch on fire if he doesn't move his ass. But he's in that sort of emotional paralysis. The story is him trying to shake himself out of this, and he eventually does. But then there's this scene later on in the story that the way Roald Dahl is writing the scene. Its pace starts kind of slow and then it gets this really quick, creepy pace to it, and there's something to it that brought to mind the scene in the original movie adaptation of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory when Gene Wilder is doing that really like spine-tingling song through the tunnel.
No earthly way of knowing he's singing which direction we are going. There's no knowing where we're rowing or which way the river's flowing. Is it raining? Is it snowing? Is a hurricane a-blowing?
That even now when I watch that movie, there's still a little kid part of me that whenever I hear that song come on, I'm like, because it's just, ugh. And I got that same sort of like nervous, fluttery sensation when I was reading the pace of this story. And I thought that was kind of interesting that a movie adaptation of one of Roald Dahl's other stories gave me the same sensation as reading the story in here, which kind of makes me wonder if the people that were writing that movie, if they were familiar with some of his adult work and worked that in somehow. But it's not all like creepy and out there and stuff. There are some in here that are honestly just funny. And one that stood out was there's a story in here called Madame Rosette. And it's mostly just about these two pilots who are on leave, and they go to this town, and they, they start out just wanting to have a night on the town, hit the bars and stuff. And then one of them gets the idea to go over to the local brothel and try to free they come up with this scheme to get all the prostitutes out of the brothel and free them. And so it's this whole story about how they pull that off. It's a good mix overall, as far as like some being eerie, some being funny, and some being just really touching. The one big downside I had with this is some of the endings on the story were really good, but the majority of the endings on these stories I felt like kind of dropped off. They weren't super strong closings. They didn't have that nice like hard impact or just like memorable even impact that I look for in short stories. I want something that, it doesn't have to be like I said, that one story had kind of a cinematic ending. When I read short stories, they don't necessarily have to have those big cinematic endings for me, but they have to have something that sticks with me where I'm like, whoa, yeah, that's a good place to end that. And a lot of these were lacking that for me. A lot of them were good stories, and then they just felt like they just dropped off, like end scene. But they didn't end in a good place for me, so I was a little bit bummed about that. But overall, I would recommend these just because I think it's good when you have somebody like Roald Dahl that's so famous for doing his children's work. I think it's good to check out some of his adult work and just experience his writing scope as a whole. And that's it. That's what I covered for reading in honor of Memorial Day. I think one of the next sort of themed videos I have coming up was, I know May was Mental Health Awareness Month, which I wanted to do something for that, but there were a few books I was working on. I just didn't quite finish the reading I wanted to do for those videos, so that one is coming up shortly, so stay tuned for that. And I think that's it for this one, so thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. Bye guys.